record this. So welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here for May's ESA Thought Leadership Forum. I'm Cindy Olson, the founder of Executive Strategic Alliance, and in a past life, the CHRO and on the 20-person executive committee of Enron. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As you heard, we are recording this, and I'll send a link to the recording in our follow-up email. And then please, you guys, feel free to ask questions by putting them into chat. Or if you feel like you want to just come off mute and ask a question, that's fine too. So either way is great. We encourage the questions. And then also we'll try and leave time at the end and between topics for questions from the audience. So I will send a follow-up email, by the way, so you don't have to really take notes, that will include the slides that Chris uses in addition to the link to the recording. So before we get started, just a teeny bit about ESA. In the past 8 years, we've partnered with ADP to build this executive community of nearly 3,000 participants in over 20 cities. And the goal is to deliver world-class thought leadership, the kind of thought leadership you would get at the conference board, and also exposure to innovative next generation startup technologies that are shaping the future of work. We're unique network in that we bring CHROs, CIOs, and other work tech executives together because we believe that they all have to be in lockstep with each other to deliver the kind of worker experience necessary to attract and retain talent. We also offer a board positioning membership that provides many of the resources an executive needs to navigate to their perfect paid board seat. So if you're interested in a private company board, public company board, or a startup board, check us out on our website. We'd love to have you join our program. And this is why we encourage executives to stay in our network even after they retire, as they're thinking about what their next life looks like. And we offer kind of how do you create this portfolio lifestyle that would include board membership at startup advisory board positions and consulting. So we're a unique network in that we do that. So today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Chris Mullen as our thought leader, and he'll be sharing insights around how organizations can create boundaryless HR. And I have to give a shout out to one of our other thought leaders, and I'm not sure if she's on yet, Solange Charas, Dr. Solange Charas, who teaches at Columbia University and on the board of the conference board. And she planted the seed for boundaryless HR with me a few months ago when she and Stella did a thought leadership around the predictions for 2024 for HR, and mentioned that in 2030, she believed that every organization was going to be moving more and more towards boundaryless HR. So after I saw a Deloitte article in the last few weeks around boundaryless HR, I went to Chris and I said, hey, I really want to do this. Can you do some research and figure out how to kind of bring this to our network? So he did that. And thanks. If you're on, Solange, thanks. And I know you'll be commenting as we go through this. So Chris Mullen has experience as an HR leader at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And since that time, he spent time at UKG as the executive director of Workforce Institute. And currently he is at ADP as the Vice President of Workplace Insights and Transformation. And in that role, he has access to some of probably the biggest database around HR related data of any company in the country. So he's going to bring a lot of insights from that ADPR Research Institute. Joining Chris today are two really accomplished executives. Deanna Jones is currently the Executive Vice President of People, Communications, and Transformation at Baker Hughes. She joined the company in January of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, right? Or right at the start of the pandemic. And before joining Baker Hughes, she served as a Senior Vice President of HR.
There are a lot of, they're almost giving away for free, the volunteer.
I'm going to mute Michael's iPhone. And then And then she also was at Marathon Oil, Newfield Exploration, and held various roles at Schlumberger for many years. Also joining the discussion is Karl Johnson, who is currently Global Senior Director, Strategic Capabilities Practice at Mars. Prior to this role, Karl led organizational development at Cargill, Syngenta, Full Circle Group, and was Assistant Dean of the Carlson School of Management. So you can see, you guys, we've got some great thought leaders and guest executives here with us today. And with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cindy. I'm excited to discuss this concept of boundaryless HR, and its really importance today on today's rapidly evolving business landscape. I think it's a really great topic. In speaking with Karl and Deanna, I mean, it's going to be an amazing conversation today. So first, I really want to kind of talk with our guests so that you have an idea of who they are and get a little bit more accustomed to what they will be bringing to the table, which is a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. So I want to welcome Deanna and Karl to this webinar. And Deanna, can you just give us an idea of your role, your responsibility? Baker Hughes is a company, like how many employees? Is it, global, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And thanks, Cindy, for putting this together and allowing us to have this conversation. I think it's a great opportunity to discuss the way that HR is transforming in the moment. So I am the Executive Vice President of People, Communications, and Transformation. I came into the organization really just to lead HR. And I think the way that my career even evolved during the period of time that I've been at Baker Hughes is a great example of that boundaryless HR. But Baker Hughes is an energy technology company. We have 58,000 people across the globe. We're operating in around 120 countries. So, this really amazing multicultural environment, global environment where we're delivering different technologies to make sure that the energy ecosystem of today, as well as the energy ecosystem of tomorrow, operates in the way that we all need to have that foundational element of delivering affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy to the globe. So it's a really great organization, and in the midst of a lot of change, right? So we talk about, every organization is changing. But, the way energy is delivered to people around the planet is changing in this moment. And so coming into the organization really came to drive a lot of transformation, right? We're a company that was founded out of two different organizations. So the former GE Oil and Gas and the legacy Baker Hughes organization. So a little bit of a merger and then a separation from an existing, very large global organization in GE. So stepped right into the pandemic and really started to think about what are the things that we need to do? What are the capabilities that we need to build for the future? And you really see, and you start to see when you get into transformation, I think exactly what we're going to talk about today, that seamless integration across functions, across the business of how do we actually deliver something different than we have in the past? How do we solve complex problems together? And how do we create an environment that people really want to work and deliver their best work? And so that's really been the journey of Baker Hughes so far. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about some of the things that we've been doing in the way that we're engaging in transformation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Karl, could you do a similar about yourself and the company?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Deanna. That's a nice segue. Yeah, I'm leading the strategic capabilities practice at Mars. It's interesting because it feels a bit like we are part of a catalyst for this boundaryless organization type of movement. So I'm newer to this terminology around it, but I think we are part and parcel of Mars's move in this direction and continued kind of transition there. Mars is a large organization, 57 billion in revenue. Comprised of 3 business units. So the one that's most recognizable is our snacking group, which would be Twix and Mars and the Skittles and those types of products. The other group is, our other two are our pet care and our food group. Pet care is an interesting business because it has a couple different business models. In the pet nutrition space, Iams and Pedigree and Royal Canin are food for pets that you may see on your grocery store shelves. But what many people don't realize is Mars actually operates a number of veterinary health networks that actually comprise the largest veterinary health system in the U.S. And that group is global as well. We also have our food group, which is products like Ben's Original Rice and things of that, which we would call more center of the plate type of products. But it's an interesting place to be because we do comprise all of these different business models and because the organization is so large. So Mars has grown quite a bit through acquisition, has an interesting approach in that space, and sometimes our group is engaged and included in those areas. But really, our capabilities practice is really around understanding what are the strategies, the transformations, the shifts that need to be reckoned with and supported across Mars in terms of developing the capabilities, which can include operating model, organization design, how work flows through the organization, et cetera. So we sit in an interesting spot because we're constantly interacting with, engaging with, and crossing boundaries and working with folks like finance and IT, et cetera, against what are essentially transformation efforts across Mars. So I'll be able to speak to that a little bit as we get into it.
I love it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Karl, so much. And again, I'm Chris Mullen. I am the Vice President of Workplace Insights and Transformation at ADP. My role is a unique one where I get to spend a lot of time with companies and at conferences discussing what's going on with the research, what's happening in the practitioner space. As someone who's a practitioner for 15 years, and then also, like Karl, I guess, I lived in academia as well. And so I really like to blend, I like to live in the intersection of research and practical application. And so that's why webinars like this that Cindy has put together are really phenomenal for me, because we get to discuss a little bit of the research, which we will do, and then talk about what's really happening out there in the world of work that you all can implement and maybe take some actionable insights from this, from our time together today. So let's dive in to what does boundaryless HR mean? And essentially, it's really about breaking down traditional barriers within the HR function to create a more agile, collaborative, and strategic approach. And I really think that this shift is crucial as it allows HR to align more closely with the overarching business objectives, and respond, I would say, more effectively and efficiently to change in the workforce and the market dynamics that a lot of you are experiencing right now. And by reallocating like these internal resources towards more strategic initiatives, organizations can really fuel development and drive business success. And so like I wanted to really start out with the evolving role of HR, which many of you are living. And so I am not going to spend a lot of time, but I think this really does set up the conversation for today. Being that HR started as an administrative function and then started to morph and change into a more supportive function as present day. And as we talk about it, HR from the pandemic, from where we are now, really needs to play a strategic role in the future of your business and company, whether it's the business objectives, the overall business. I mean, it really is kind of to me, an inflection point for HR, where how do we not only do the administrative functions, be supportive of our employees in the business, but also how do we launch to be more strategic? Because HR touches so many areas of the business, the employees, the talent, payroll, benefits, you name it. And so, with that, we've seen HR evolve, like I said, and this transition really does go from how do we get from being tactical to more strategic? some of the best HR functions that I interact with on a daily, weekly, monthly basis are the ones that not only get the tactical work done, but are spending even more time thinking strategically and working, not just thinking about it, but working strategically with your C-suite. And that's really essential for the business. So, I think really, in HR, I sometimes explain it this way: is HR is like our job descriptions, that 5% at the bottom of our job descriptions, other duties as assigned. A lot of times that's HR. And so now HR has on its plate DEI and B, mental health. The pandemic happened, so that was a lot of that was on HR's plate. How do you communicate? How do we, go virtual? And there was a lot of, like Karl talked about, cross-functionality with IT and other groups in the organization. So no longer can HR be a silo. And I think that really is what Boundaryless HR is talking about, is how do we reduce organizational silos? Because there's a key benefit of this boundaryless HR and that approach. And it fosters, better collaboration and innovation. In reading and researching this boundaryless HR, I can see, myself when I was a practitioner using a lot of it, but like I think Karl, Deanna said, that the term's a little different than what I was used to. There are companies out there that are really focusing on this idea of people expertise. And so how do we, there was one company, there was a company out there that I was researching, and they decided to take their HR and split up their managers and cross the whole company into two different areas: people managers and work managers. One managed all the people and those aspects, and the other managed the projects and the work. And it was a really interesting concept. So with that, I want to hear from the panel. What is your experience with boundaryless HR? This idea where HR can pivot, it's dynamic, it's got this unifying element to the business. What's your experience with that? And how has your organization taken steps to implement maybe some of these approaches? Deanna, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, for me, when I read through the article and you think about, using the language of boundaryless HR, I think there's always been HR practitioners who operated in that fashion where they saw their role or their the way they could create value in the organization is to pull people together in ways that they could actually do work differently. And so the example that I would use for us, sustainability is a huge part of our strategy. So, how do we make a cleaner energy ecosystem for the future? How do we make sure that we're investing in people around the globe and ensuring that we have people with the right skills and capabilities out into the future? And what does the governance of all of that look like? So how do we, really think about that ESG framework? And it's something where we have a multidisciplinary team, right? It's something we're embedding as a capability into the organization. And so in working with the chief sustainability officer, it was really, okay, what are all the mechanisms? What are all the levers that managers are going to have to pull from a change management standpoint to really have this be something that it's not a separate area of SME practice, but it becomes something that each and every one of us inside the organization is really embedding into the way that we do business. So it's not something separate and apart that we're going to do. And so, we started out with making sure, for example, that we had multidisciplinary teams and that we were engaging people from the business right from the get-go. We've created an employee resource group, which is owned and managed by the employees themselves around sustainability practices and how they can share information across the organization. But when you bring together those multidisciplinary teams, I think one of the biggest challenges is around budget. So it's like, well, we want to do this or we want to do that. So who's paying for it? And there's a lot of times where as the HR leader, I was like, I'll pay for it. And then we started to have discussions. Well, why is HR paying for this particular area of practice? Or why is HR paying for that initiative? And I'm like, because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's all part of the enterprise and part of what we want to do to drive the enterprise forward. It's a matter of having someone who's going to say yes in terms of being able to drive that initiative forward. And then once people see the value, of course, you'll see that budget or that spend actually go in different places. But I think it's just one example of, the partnership with sustainability, where it's like, it's not my role entirely, but it is such a key part of driving our strategy forward. How do I help enable it? How do I make sure that the right people are in the room having the discussions so that we've embedded it in the organization? And if I look today, we have about 800 people who are sitting in that employee resource group, spread across the company. We've managed to reduce emissions inside of the company almost 30% since our benchmark, which is huge. And a lot of that just comes again from those ideas and things that bubble up from across the organization. And I think the momentum that we have to move that forward really stems from the fact that we're working in this multidisciplinary team. And it's something we're embedding as a capability in all of the leaders and all of the people across the company.
So I'm hearing that, from you, and that great example that you just gave, is that it sounds like innovation has gone up, like with the ideas. You're meeting some major goals with the sustainability, at least from this example. Were there any other benefits that jumped to the top of your mind about, like, it wasn't just about the innovation, it was about the interaction of the employees? What other benefits did you kind of like?
Yeah, I think
from an HR perspective, this is amazing.
totally. I think what you see is everyone, so what we know, I think a lot, is that employees want to work, or people want to work in companies where there's a purpose. And, there's a lot of elements of the legacy energy ecosystem, hydrocarbons, that people are like, well, I have a hard time working in an organization that's actually, working with hydrocarbons. But the purpose element of this, it's like there's this incremental piece of what people want to give to their work, where they're like, when I exchange the time and energy and effort, I want to do it where I feel like I'm making a difference. And we had a lot of employees who have worked inside of, some of our businesses for 25, 30 years. And they said, I'm proud that I can go home every night and have a conversation with my kids about, this is how we're changing and this is what we're doing differently. And I have access to that information directly. And I might not be on a day-to-day basis doing that, but I'm part of an organization and an enterprise that is. And so that incremental effort in terms of how people are engaging. And then you start to see, well, now I've engaged with people across the organization. And I'm like, oh, like I can see how we can deliver for our customers in a different way, because I've put people in a room together that otherwise wouldn't have been in a room together. And so you start to see, oh, this is how we can share information more fluidly across the organization, not just in delivery of the sustainability initiatives that we have, but in the day-to-day work. We could collaborate more, we could create efficiency here. So you see all of those elements of productivity that dovetail out of that. And then just the pride of the work that's going on and the willingness to share that on multiple platforms. So we use LinkedIn quite a bit. We have a lot of our employees who are sharing information about what we're doing, and that helps enhance, for example, our employee value proposition or the brand and the ability, not a lot of people would know the name Baker Hughes. Like Karl, I think Mars, most of us know that name. And so it's really great to see people to have examples or things that they want to share where it's more accessible for the average person versus, some of the very complicated technologies that we actually deliver. And if you're not in these spaces and working in those areas, that's not as engaging. And I think, part of what HR brought to the table was really creating that framework of connecting the right people into the initiative and saying, this is who needs to be working on this project. This is how we can rotate people through that sustainability team and make sure that they then get embedded out into the business so that our leaders can grow and learn together, because it's new for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that HR was facilitating the conversations in the relationship. So thank you so much for sharing that. Karl, I'd love to turn to you. What's your experience with boundaryless HR? It's such a tongue twister.
Yeah, it is a bit. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm presuming everybody, in this is meaning it. We've all been a part of this journey, right? For me, it spans 3 companies over the last few years, from Syngenta, a smaller 14 billion global company, to Cargo, which is actually the largest privately held company in North America, now to Mars. And before that, you mentioned, Chris, yeah, I was an assistant dean at one of the top business schools at the US with a really great HR program within that, right? So, in reading the article and getting acquainted with boundaryless HR, I think we're at this stage and where it's interesting to me that we're still calling ourselves strategic business partners, because I think there's been a transition to business leader. And we've actually moved from partnership and the seat at the table over the last 20 years, as we've sort of or longer, lived through this. The question is how does HR become a strategic partner? But I think it's more than partnership. And one of the things I've been, really close to, in particular here at Mars, is really the importance of HR and our work in actually being integrated with the business strategy in a different way. So one of the ways that we're doing this at Mars is really around talent strategy. And the name of my team is purposeful around strategic capabilities, because the question is, what are the capabilities, not just talent, but operating model, org design, et cetera, that are required to execute in the marketplace and to support the strategies within the business. From a specific talent strategy perspective, it's so important that as a business leader, HR is really there, in fact, along the way and with and contributing to strategy, not just reacting to it, right? So I've seen this shift where the voice of HR is actually part of the strategy discussion, not reactive to it, right? And so that's been happening over time. And then it's really, and then being agile and understanding the strategic shifts, the acquisitions, the shifting market dynamics, and really just being first person in those discussions as a part of that with senior leadership teams at the CXO level, et cetera. But in particular, integrating this perspective with strategic planning and budgeting cycles of the business. So what we're finding at Mars is we're stepping into a more sophisticated approach to workforce planning. And so that's predicated with the idea that if you're really going to look at workforce planning, it needs to be integrated with the typical planning cycles of the business. So there's really this triangle that's emerging, which is HR, finance, and IT. That's what we're seeing in Mars. And that's really what we're managing, is this idea that, look, if you're really going to do workforce planning in a meaningful way, and if you're going to kind of, a bit to Deanna's point around budget, actually do this in a purposeful manner that fits with the rhythm of the business, you've got to get out ahead of that cycle. And you've got to have really close partnership and integration with the finance and the IT function, because it's the IT owns the data that's really going to drive decision-making, both the data quality relative to people, and then finance with the financial data. So one of the things that's, it's this real point of interest and a lot of energy that we're putting at present against this at Mars is really around doing this actually in parallel with the business, looking at the markets, at their customers, at the trends and the external environment from that way. We, at the same time, are looking at what's the external scan of the talent environment, doing that in the same manner that the business looks and does that and understands that from a business perspective, and then integrating that outside in perspective with an analysis of where we are in terms of current state. Do we have the organizational capabilities needed today? And this includes workforce skills, operating model, org design, culture. All of those elements come into that internal assessment. And then we get back to this, okay, how do we triangulate with finance, with IT, and with others across the organization to really come to a compelling view of what's the talent strategy that mirrors up to, parallels with, and supports the business strategy, which is a little bit different. And I think it approaches this premise of boundaryless HR in terms of really, really deep partnership breaking down and sharing and collaborating across the organization and that way around workforce planning. And I can give you one other example is we've stood up talent marketplace as a pilot. So this is a real interesting concept. I don't know if you're playing in this space, Deanna, at Baker Hughes, but I mean, this is a real playground. This is the intent here is we've opened it up to a limited portion of our 140,000 employees. So we've got, I think it's more like 5 or 6 thousand employees who are within the pilot. But the premise is that it enables leaders to post these gig opportunities for which they could use support, and it enables employees, for their part, to go in there and search and look for some opportunities. Opportunities which for them could be stretch assignments in which they can build experiences, skills, relationships outside of the reporting culture. And I think it's this early indication of what the workforce might look like in a few years. Like this may become more and more prevalent. It's really aligning skills and skills development with the work that needs to be done. It's sort of gradually eroding or at least softening up some of the silos within the workplace, because folks can get outside of their area of Mars and explore some other areas in the organization. And but it does require some kind of greater clarity on what skills reside within the org and what's needed to accomplish the work. And it challenges all these organizational boundaries, and because it's a platform that spans, businesses and functions. And then it just comes down to leaders and whether they feel like they own their talent, and also them reconsidering what's their value of leaders if we're actually going to have talent shift throughout the org in these kinds of ways. It confounds traditional, more rigid kind of management style. So I just throw those out as a couple of examples, I think, that sort of sit within this space and are some areas that we're exploring in Mars.
Yeah, I think the both of you put out there some really great stuff. Now I have like 6 questions. Let me start with this. So it sounds to me from both of your experiences that yes, boundaryless HR is very heavily dependent upon relationships. The relationships that HR has with the other business units, the rest of the C-suite. What's your top tip or two from each of you on how do you build that relationship from an HR standpoint? How do you build the relationship with IT or finance that sometimes HR might not have as much interaction with, to help gain that voice, that strategic leader voice that you talked about, Karl?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with the problem to solve. It's, I think in large part, what we're really looking at are things that are compelling, right? And it's like Deanna's example around sustainability. What better reason to bring people into a room and get organized and collaborate and really figure out how to get this done? So I think the big part is, when I talk about finance and IT, with finance, look, I mean, talent is a huge asset. It may be the biggest investment or cost, depending on your lens, in the company, even for a manufacturing company like ours. So there's a compelling reason that finance people want to be at the table, or should, when you're talking about developing a talent strategy, looking out 3 years into the future, understanding what the talent landscape looks like, and then backing into what are the fiscal implications of that. I mean, it's really, that's easy, right? That's with IT, it's, I mean, it falls into their domain. I mean, it's, for me, the really bright red line through everything is data.
Yeah.
So it's that's not a hard ask either, really.
Nice thread that everyone has to play in.
Yeah. But I think it's, I think Deanna calls out some really good points around investment, So I think a lot of this is when we look in these spaces, there's a fiscal tag attached sometimes. And what I find is that finance leaders sometimes are actually your best advocates in turning what is a cost conversation into an investment conversation, you know, so this sort of forward-looking view of, look, if we don't do this, we're just not going to get to our 2030 or 2028 goals, you know. So I kind of take a breath here and let Deanna.
You know, what's you have a top tip for us on building those relationships?
So I loved the triangle that Karl was talking about, because I do think in this moment, I think it's always been there, but I think it's really highlighted in this moment because of the way that work is changing, where you really have IT coming into that loop, because it is about what's the deployment of technology look like. And we've had some conversations in our group where, you know, we think about the cost or investment of people, and we, you know, compensation and benefits, and it's like, and then we have technology in a different bucket. And I think we're in this moment where those two things are really converging, and you sort of say the technology delivers the same activity as what the people do, or in some cases it does, right? And so thinking about that, you know, in a cohesive fashion. But I guess I don't know that it's a tip, but what I recently did is I actually have one of my HR team members who is actually seconded to finance while we're going through this transformation. And she supports HR and IT in their respective transformations in this data conversation that we're having, Karl, around workforce planning. How do you get what finance needs to understand the cost or the investment of the people, what we need to do from an HR standpoint in terms of how are we characterizing or collecting data around skills, and then how are we deploying that through a system that really is allowing the business leaders to make the best possible decisions about where they deploy talent. And I think it was a shock for everybody about, well, why would she? And even I think sometimes she's like, is this a good idea for my career? And I'm like, no, trust me, it's a really great idea for your career. Yeah. It's really going to differentiate you. But we don't often see an HR person going into a different function, and certainly not finance, you know, but she had that financial acumen. And as we were working with the teams, it made a lot of sense. And the CFO and the person who leads planning, they are loving having her there because she's such a great translator for all the things that we need to get done. And so it's a great example for other people. You know, we also within HR, I talked about HR people creating strengths. So it wasn't sort of your classic, oh, I'm going to become a compensation expert, or I'm going to go do this course on talent development. We talked a lot about building capability in project management and change management and data and analytics and growth mindset. And it was a curiosity for the HR team, but I'm like, if we're not good at these skills, we won't be able to be business leaders at the table. And Karl, I love that. You know, we are business leaders at the table. It's not a matter of being a strategic business partner. We're there talking about strategy, talking about the business, and sort of saying, how do we actually create the environment for success for everyone, you know, in the way that we think about taking the business forward. So I think there's a level of curiosity, you know, I think it goes back to those silos. Like, don't be afraid to step out of those silos. I worked with a CFO who had started as an engineer, and he told a story about it was basically his van pooling that created the environment for him to talk to someone who was in finance, which led to his career in finance, because he said, I just became so intrigued with it. But I think that for me is the create the curiosity and create those pathways where we're welcoming people into the HR function from other parts of the organization. And in corollary, we're actually encouraging our HR people to go into different things.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful example of like how, if you're out there listening to this or watching us, do you have that translator, that additional team member that you either send out or invite in? I mean, what was it, 7 years ago? I did the same thing with IT from an HR perspective. I worked with our head of IT and invited one of his team members into the HR team, and he lived within HR for a couple of years. He had a dotted line to me and a solid line back to IT, but he was an awesome translator. That was a great term on what HR's needs were to transform the business. And then he could translate it back to IT and say, here's what their needs are. Let us help get that done. And he attended all of our team meetings. You know, anything that we did as a team and communications, he was on everything. And so it was a wonderful example, I think, of what the both of you are also talking about here. We've talked a little bit about talent here, so I am not going to spend a ton of time here, but we do know from a talent perspective that the generations are changing, right? We're seeing significant changes in the generations from a workforce perspective, where millennials and Gen Z are becoming more prominent in the workforce. And so you can see the statistics here. I pulled that up, but I wanted to take an example of, from an HR payroll perspective. And so the current state of an HR generalist, you can see here, breakdown by years, how old they are. And the demand is high. 70% of CEOs expect their CHRO to be a key player in the enterprise. To Karl and Deanna, your point, business leaders, not just HR leaders. And from the ADP Research Institute, I pulled some of the data that they have out in their Today at Work issue. And it talks about how to me, it's interesting. Employers that expand their HR ranks, they really might reduce turnover, at least to a point. So you see here that on the left-hand side that HR staffing has increased over the years. And then you see on the right-hand side that there is, we see maybe some correlation. We see that there could be a relationship here with how many HR staffing, how many HR folks you have, to the decrease in turnover. And so it could decrease turnover, but then at some point there's too much HR staffing. And something similar is happening in the payroll world. And so the current state of the payroll practitioner, you'll see here, and I'm just going to highlight it, that the average age is 48. And so this is a really different contrast from HR to payroll. So 74% of practitioners are over the age of 40, and the average age is 48. So there's not as many younger workers moving into the payroll profession. So I think the payroll profession is a really good example to me of what could be happening in the talent space. So, sometimes it comes down to communication. And so from a payroll perspective, there could be this knowledge gap. It adds to the challenge of just one profession in the business world. And so folks are not looking for a career path right now into payroll. Karl, this might actually, your example of gig work could be a really good example to get more people into the payroll profession by doing some stretch assignments or gig work. There's a huge increase in the number of payroll practitioners that are out there, that in jobs, there's so many job openings at the moment. It really lends itself to the question, should HR be considering, how do you either outsource, use managed services? A lot of the tactical administrative functions, how do we create more margin, I think is what I'm trying to say, in HR. How are the two of you doing that? Deanna, can we start with you?
Yeah, so the payroll one really struck me because our global payroll leader has been on, I'll call it a retirement path for the last 2 years. And we went to so we did not have a natural successor inside the organization. We went to the open market. There was not a lot of people. When you start to look really at global payroll and you say the complexity of operating in the number of countries that we do, the deployment of technology in all of those countries, making sure that you're actually addressing all of the tax challenges. And for me, what's interesting is I compare and contrast sort of the role of your tax leader inside the finance function to the role of the payroll leader, either inside of HR or in some organizations it sits in finance, and why we value tax, right, as it relates to one area of the business so differently than it does when we're talking about this employment, where it's like, if payroll is wrong, that is the number one, you're not going to talk about anything else. If payroll is wrong, if it's not working well, that's it. That's where the conversation with the CEO stops, right? So we ended up in a situation where we actually went back into the finance function and said, okay, where do we have high potential talent? And can we move someone who's maybe doing a broader accounting role into payroll, specialize there, their knowledge so that they actually can take on this leadership role. And that's the direction that we went. But I see it with a lot of the SME roles that we have, in compensation, is those areas of practice. As we built up the HR business partner, we maybe neglected, I think, making sure that people went on that deep domain path as well. And in many cases, because we said, well, this is an area where we're looking at automation, or we look at, sort of some centralized shared services, I don't know that we've valued some of those SME areas in the way that we need to as a function. And so we do see that gap, in people who are highly skilled and have the experiences they need, because that area of practice, payroll, is one that I think gets more and more complex every year. Every country will introduce, new legislation, and trying to find those. So I think striking that balance between, well, I'm a trusted business partner with the leaders in the organization, and saying, this is a fundamental area of subject matter expertise that we need to have, because it carries high risk and high governance challenges if it's done wrong, and then valuing those roles in the right way to attract the talent into those areas.
And for folks out there, I just use payroll as an example because of, Deanna, like what you said, that the implications of getting it wrong. But we're seeing it in the healthcare industry, like the lack of talent, or folks coming up. There's not enough. I mean, I'm doing something else for healthcare later this week, but I'm reading like there's not even enough faculty to train the nurses. And so like we're seeing it in different industries, payroll being one of them. Karl, do you have any insight into like different areas of HR or payroll that we should be considering as opposed to keeping it in-house? Do we look elsewhere? Deanna's bringing someone else from inside, right? Upskilling. What's your take on this?
Well, I guess I've got probably a little more macro take on it, which is, in the last organization I was in at Cargill, I was a part of the Global Human Resource Services Group, which that's such a large organization, over 1,300 of us in this shared services group. And then we have a similar but little different model here at Mars, with a Mars Global Services Group across all of this. So there's this, I think the questions really are, what do you insource relative to a shared services group or a COE model? So a lot of what we're talking about, our rewards team is a COE, and they rewards and benefits, whereas Kronos, ADP, other groups like that are an outsource for us. And then there's that third choice of what are you, in these, if they're repeatable processes, and if there's this deep SME kind of experience that goes toward it, it looks like something that's a good target for centralization in a shared services group or a COE or an external party. But I think it goes back to some of our original conversation around HR, which is how do we take some of this off the plate of our HR talent, really, and in this business leader type of role, it's how do we get some of this more transactional or specific SME stuff housed in the right place and put there, and the focus on it and the investment there, so that we can focus on other business strategy and things of that nature in our roles. So
I think that's wonderful. And I know we're coming up with a few more minutes to go, but I wanted to share, this is one of my last slides that I wanted to share, because it really did come out of that Deloitte study that we were referencing. But this idea of the knowing and doing gap, and what it talks about is respondents know that shifting HR to a cross-functional discipline is important, but fewer doing it. So you'll see 72% say, yep, it's important for HR to be cross-functional. 41% say they're doing something, and 11% say they're doing great things. So not as many people are doing it. And Deloitte really talks about what is that gap. So I think as we end, I would love to hear from the two of you, as you thought about boundaryless HR over the last couple of weeks, and as we've discussed it today, what would be your top tip or two or takeaway for those watching and listening on how they could start the process of a boundaryless HR? What questions should they ask themselves or consider? Not that there's a one size fits all, but what should they be considering? Anybody specific would like to start?
I'll go ahead and start because I'll build off of what Karl was talking about with HR shared services. And I think it's something, or shared service center, right? So what the part of the journey we've been on at Baker Hughes is actually, I would say, migrating to a more multifunctional shared service center. And I think it's in organizations that are big enough, or even in the way that you think about where those activities are done. So it's like, where is the best place for those activities to sit? And where will you gain the most productivity and efficiency and actually create opportunity for the people? So when we shifted our HR service center over into our enterprise excellence team, a lot of people are like, why are we doing that? You know, those people are HR, their career paths are here. We shifted it over, and the leader of that shared service center said, this is the best decision we've made, because he said, you know, we're focused over here on vendor management and process and the adoption of technology and automation. And he's like, all of those skill sets exist in this enterprise excellence team in a way that they don't in HR. And what it does, as Karl was talking about, is it frees up your time to think about how you can create value for the organization a different way. It made my team significantly smaller. So if, you know, I'm looking for, oh, my team has to be a certain size, or I'm worried about, you know, for me, I think when you get into, and we're not yet doing marketplace, Karl, but it's an aspiration. I've toyed around with it, but you got to have those skills, and you got to understand and have people who are lean into it. But I think the biggest thing is, if you can shift activities to other places where it does free up bandwidth for you to think differently about the business, I think that's the doing something
Yeah.
allows you to eventually move to doing great things. If you do nothing, and for me, in every HR team, all the organizations I've been part of, HR will resist the change. We are so good at helping other parts of the business lean into change, but when it's like us having to change, it's tricky, it's tough. You know, we want to keep things the same as well, because, you know, we've had these long history, and sometimes we're not as confident with, oh, hey, I can gain skills that can be of value to the business, even if they aren't in the activities or practices that I've done my entire career in HR. And so I think just helping our HR people think about how they can reskill as well, or multi-skill in ways that they can move seamlessly across the business, is an important part of that change.
Yeah, I think for me, with one of my payroll examples of automating a lot of the processes, I ended up saving all of my payroll practitioners over half their time by automating the process. And so they thought, well, we're gonna get rid of FTEs. I said, no, we're gonna repurpose some of your responsibilities. Now, instead, I want you to go out to every one of our departments and be at all their team meetings, because I want to get ahead of the issues instead of being reactive all the time. I wanted to be more proactive. And to your point, it gave them a different skill set than what they were used to, and helped them grow. Karl, what would be your actionable insights or takeaways from today?
Overall themes. Yeah, I think what you're hearing across what Deanna and I have both shared is, we may not have known it, but we're in the middle of boundaryless HR. And so this partnership, this collaboration, this idea that that finance, IT, others that there's a Venn diagram, and it's really at those intersections are really where most of the really exciting, playful, good, beneficial work resides. You know, it's like we couldn't stand up a playing field around talent marketplace if we weren't kind of bridging and coordinating and collaborating across those spaces. I think there's another piece. Well, I'll just leave it there. Yeah, thanks.
I think for me, it's that, from listening to the both of you and my own experience as a practitioner, it's just to remember that adopting a boundaryless HR approach is really a journey that requires continuous effort, collaboration, and like a commitment to the strategic transformation, not just of HR, but the business. And I think that's what companies are looking for in this day and age. I hope that everyone here found this discussion on advancing boundaryless HR insightful and inspiring. I know I did, working with Karl and Deanna. I cannot thank you both enough for your valuable insights. Cindy, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Hopefully everyone will connect with us. And if you have any questions, please, we're happy to hear them.
Thanks, Chris. Oh gosh, you guys, you were great. Deanna and Karl, lots of information shared. I will add one thing, and I don't usually jump in and add anything, but Deanna and Karl, there is a CHRO that I'm very good friends with, that she's the CHRO, really the CAO of Williams Companies in Tulsa. Her name's Debbie Cohen Pickle, and she has done the same thing, Karl. She's created a marketplace of talent at Williams, and she's actually got data that shows how much the employees have embraced it and love it. So I'll introduce both you guys to her. I think you'll find what she's done interesting, and plus she's got the data to kind of show how to do it and why it's important. And next
I
month
think that's a great point, because I think employees really want growth.
they
They
do.
don't stuck in a
They
job.
do.
There's no
Yeah.
more career ladders. It's a career lattice now.
No,
It's
I
all
agree.
important to
I totally agree. And I mean, one thing I'll just add, the last survey that we did when I was at Enron, and it was August of 2001, 4 months before we actually filed for bankruptcy, I was appalled when the question we asked was, do you use 100% do you use all your skills at work? And I thought, oh yeah, they all use them because they're also busy. Only 50% of the people said they use all their skills at work. So that right there told me, it tells me today, there's a lot of people in the organizations that have capacity to do other things and build their resumes. So I mean, that was one of those questions I look back on and I go, gosh, wish I could have done something about that then.
And it adds to meaningful work for employees, and they want that as well.
Yeah, exactly. But Debbie's got some real examples, and she's got data on how it's changed the dynamics and how much people love it. So I'll make sure you guys are introduced to Debbie. And then the other thing I will mention, that we've got Ted Billilees, who is a partner at Alex Partners, talking about how PE firms and their portfolio companies are really trying to deliver results, and they're focused on, as you would guess, leadership, and then transformation and change management, and how they utilize those in making sure they deliver that value. So tune in next month. I think it's on June 27th. Look for the invite. But thanks everybody for being here. Deanna and Karl, you were amazing. And Chris, you were great. So appreciate it. See you guys.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.